When we ask, why is Putin betting on Trump, we're really asking something deeper. Why does the Kremlin see more opportunity in one man than in entire governments, alliances, and coalitions? For Vladimir Putin, politics has always been about exploiting cracks in societies, in institutions, and in rival leaders. And when it comes to Donald Trump, those cracks are not only visible, they are strategic entry points. Let's be clear. Putin knows he cannot outmatch NATO in raw power. He cannot outproduce the West economically. But he understands personalities, pressure points, and cycles of politics. Trump represents something Putin has always valued: unpredictability and transactional diplomacy. A man who says, let's make a deal even in places where others would draw red lines. For the Kremlin, Trump is not just a politician, he is a disruption machine. Someone who questions NATO, doubts the European Union, and focuses on America first rather than alliance solidarity. In Moscow's calculation, that means less unity in the West and more room for Russia to maneuver in Ukraine, in Europe, and even in global energy markets. But this is not just about admiration, it's about timing. Putin sees Trump's political calendar, the elections, the pressure to deliver quick wins, as the opposite of his own strategy of long power. While Putin can wait out sanctions and grind through a war of attrition, Trump will be forced to show results fast, and that imbalance creates leverage. In other words, Trump's short-term urgency may become Putin's long-term advantage. And that's where we need to go next. Why exactly did Putin lose faith in dealing with Biden and Europe, and why does that make Trump look like his best and perhaps only chance? To understand why Putin is betting on Trump, we first need to see why he essentially wrote off Biden and Europe. Under Joe Biden, Washington has been consistent, almost relentless in keeping the Western alliance together. Billions in military aid to Ukraine, sanctions that cut deep into Russia's economy, and, most importantly, diplomatic discipline. Despite political noise in the US and war fatigue in Europe, Biden has managed to keep NATO from fracturing. For Putin, that's a nightmare. Europe, too, has surprised the Kremlin. Putin once believed European leaders were divided, dependent on Russian gas, and too risk-averse to confront Moscow. But the war in Ukraine changed that calculation. Germany rearmed, Finland and Sweden joined NATO, and even hesitant countries lined up behind sanctions and military aid. Instead of splitting, Europe consolidated. And Putin knows this. Biden and Europe together are locked into a strategy of containment. No personal deals, no quick resets, no backroom bargains. The Kremlin thrives on ambiguity, but Biden and Brussels offer him none. That's where Trump looks so different. Trump questions NATO's very purpose, talks openly about reducing U.S. commitments abroad, and treats diplomacy as a business negotiation rather than a long-term security architecture. From Putin's perspective, this is not weakness, it's opportunity. Next, we'll explore exactly what Putin hopes to gain from Trump's potential return, the deals, the concessions, and the global shifts that could reshape the war in Ukraine and the balance of power worldwide. So, what exactly does Putin expect from Trump's potential return to the White House? First, he's betting on division. If Trump questions NATO's purpose or even threatens to pull the U.S. back from its obligations, that alone would shake European unity. For the Kremlin, NATO uncertainty is as valuable as a battlefield victory. Second, Putin sees Trump as a deal-maker president. Unlike Biden, who frames the conflict in terms of values and democracy, Trump frames everything as a transaction. That opens the door for bargaining. Ukraine in exchange for sanctions relief, or security guarantees in Europe in exchange for scaling back military aggression. For Moscow, even the possibility of such talks is a huge strategic win. Third, there's timing. Putin believes in what he calls long power. He waits out Western leaders, betting that democracies grow tired while autocracies endure. Trump's potential 4 years could be the window Putin needs to freeze the war on his terms, lock in territorial gains, and pressure Kyiv into concessions it would never make under current Western backing. And finally, Trump's America First worldview could weaken global coalitions. If Washington reduces its leadership role, Europe fractures, sanctions ease, and Russia gains breathing space in the global economy. For Putin, this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about reasserting Russia as a global power without paying the crushing price of isolation. But here's the real question. Is Putin miscalculating? Could Trump's unpredictability backfire against the Kremlin? In the next block, we'll explore the risks of Putin's gamble and why betting on Trump might be far more dangerous than Moscow assumes. Now let's talk about the risks. Betting on Trump is not a guaranteed win for Putin. It's a dangerous gamble. Why? Because Trump is unpredictable. Yes, he talks about cutting U.S. spending on Ukraine, but remember, he also loves projecting strength. If he ever feels Putin is making him look weak, Trump could flip and authorize a harder line than even Biden has taken. That volatility is something the Kremlin cannot control. There's also the issue of America's institutions. Even if Trump wanted to strike a grand bargain with Putin, Congress, the Pentagon, and NATO allies would resist. Ukraine has strong bipartisan support in key areas, and sanctions on Russia are deeply embedded in U.S. law. One man in the Oval Office cannot simply dismantle that overnight, no matter how much Moscow wishes it were true. And then comes Europe. If Trump distances the U.S. from Ukraine, Europe might actually double down, taking on greater responsibility for Kyiv's survival. Leaders in Poland, the Baltic states, and even Germany have signaled they are preparing for that scenario. So instead of weakening Ukraine, Trump's return could accelerate Europe's independence in security policy, something Putin has always feared. In other words, Putin may think he's holding the stronger hand, but he's also exposing himself to massive uncertainty. Betting on Trump is like playing high-stakes poker. You might win big, or you might lose everything. Which brings us to the final piece of this puzzle. Why does Putin take such risks, and what does this tell us about his broader strategy for survival on the world stage? That's what we'll break down in the last block. At the end of the day, Putin's bet on Trump isn't just about Ukraine. It's about his own survival and the survival of his system. The war has locked Russia into an exhausting conflict that bleeds resources, costs thousands of lives, and isolates Moscow from the West. For Putin, a Trump victory represents not only a chance to weaken Ukraine, but also to fracture the Western alliance that has kept Russia in check. Think about it. Putin has built his regime on the idea of outlasting his opponents. He survived sanctions after Crimea, he endured isolation after the poisoning scandals, and now he's pushing through the bloodiest war in Europe since World War II. His calculation is simple. If he can wait longer than the West, he wins. And in Trump, he sees a shortcut, a leader who might willingly undercut the Western Front from within. But here's the irony. By betting everything on Trump, Putin also shows weakness. A strong, confident Russia wouldn't need a political shakeup in Washington to change the course of the war. The fact that the Kremlin is so invested in America's elections tells us that Putin knows time is not fully on his side. So, why is Putin betting on Trump? Because for him, this isn't just strategy. It's desperation wrapped in calculation. He needs a fracture, a break in the system, a moment of chaos he can exploit. Whether that gamble pays off or whether it backfires and leaves Russia even more cornered will define the next chapter of this war. And that's where we leave it for now. If you want to understand the stakes of this geopolitical poker game, follow along. We're just at the beginning of a new and dangerous phase.